Welcome to the first edition of Planet Politics, an Australian View. It's been broadcast on the eve of Donald Trump's inauguration for a second term as US President. I'm Andrew Clark, and I've just entered my 60th year as a journalist. Well, it has come. No, this is not a reference to Trump's return to the White House, but to the words Australia's wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin, uttered on the morning of December 8, 1941, when he woke to the news that the Japanese had bombed the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Fearing a Japanese invasion, Curtin secured American protection. Australian forces came under the command of US General Douglas MacArthur, and nearly 1 million American soldiers passed through Australia during the Pacific War. This was just one of a patchwork of alliances signed by the US during and after World War II. Combined with the US-designed post-war economic order, the result was the so-called American century of enlightened self-interest. Although Trump's return to the White House could mean America comes up short in the final 20 years. But 8 decades of American Pacto-mania and just about cover the world and include wartime enemies like Japan and Germany. The main alliance bulwark has been the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which was formed to defend Western Europe against a possible attack by the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact, and it was signed in 1949. Original NATO signatories were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the UK, and the US. NATO spawned the 1954 Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or SEATO, which came into being after the US recruited allies like Britain and Australia to take part in the Korean War. Over the following decades, soldiers from South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand fought alongside US troops in Vietnam, with different US ally sign-ons for the 2 Gulf Wars in the 90s, and the conflict in the 90s and 2003, and the conflict in Afghanistan. Motivated by what Australia's foreign policy strategist, the late Alan Gyngell, termed fear of abandonment, Australia's largely unquestioned support for the US was aimed at securing American backing should Australia be threatened by countries like China and Indonesia. Similar thinking about shoring up national security was behind the UK's involvement in the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, and Korean conflicts, although it shied away from committing troops to the disastrous US-led military intervention in Vietnam. Meanwhile, Washington was busy securing a global post-war economic order along the lines of enlightened self-interest. A more open trading system and orderly currency relations, anchored by the US dollar, paved the way for an explosion in world trade, a sharp rise in living standards, and a benign setting for US overseas investments, or what one wit branded Coca-colonization. This was at a time when America accounted for almost half the world's GDP, whereas now its share is around 25%, according to a range of estimates. Back in July 1944, or a year before the war ended, 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to regulate the post-war international financial system. They agreed to an ostensible US plan, although significant elements were mapped out by British economist John Maynard Keynes. This established the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements. Both institutions inaugurated a system geared to avoid the wild fluctuations in currency values and increased protectionism that led to the Great Depression and contributed to the rise of Nazism and the most destructive war in world history. The Bretton Woods Conference agreed to the IMF, overseeing a system of exchange rates pegged to a fixed gold price, with discretion to move 10% either way or more, with a detailed warning and justification. At the time, IMF members pledged to make their currencies convertible for trade-related transactions. Complementing these reforms, a US-designed series of conferences led to the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs in Trade, or GATT, in 1948, and the more activist World Trade Organization, or WTO, 45 years later. Both were committed to lower protection and making currencies convertible for trade-related transactions. The governing idea behind this global financial and trade makeover was open markets. According to then US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Bretton Woods heralded the end of economic nationalism, or the beggar thy neighbour regimes of rising protectionism that prolonged the Great Depression. An American-led global financial order resulted in Europe's post-war economic recovery and an astonishing rise in living standards in first Japan, followed by South Korea, China, and much of Southeast Asia. According to the WTO, world trade is now roughly 44 times the level recorded in the early days of the GATT. No other country in world history has been responsible for the economic transformation of 2 continents and more than 2 billion people. But now the American-led order or era of enlightened self-interest is at risk from America. To capture this point in a vivid metaphor, Edward Luce, the Washington-based correspondent for the London Financial Times, has reached back to the destruction of ancient Rome. Rome was not destroyed by outsiders. Its demolition was the work of barbarians from within, Luce wrote on November 20, 15 days after Trump's election victory. It is time to study Caligula. That most notorious of Roman emperors killed what was left of the Republic and centralized authority in himself. Ring any bells? Donald Trump does not need to make his horse a senator. It will be enough to keep appointing charlatans to America's great offices of state, Luce wrote. His commentary was published a day before former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz withdrew his nomination to be Trump's Attorney General amid bipartisan disquiet in the Congress over disputed claims of Gaetz's involvement in sex trafficking with minors. As this article is being written, there are reservations regarding particularly on the Democratic side of the Congress, regarding the nominations of Pete Hegseth as Defense Secretary over disputed claims that he was involved in a sexual assault and public drunkenness, Kash Patel as putative FBI head over his threats to politicize the police and bring the media to heel, former US Congress member Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence over her claimed support for Russian President Vladimir Putin and recently ousted Syrian dictator Bashar Assad, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Health and Human Services Secretary over his historic opposition to fluoride, the polio vaccine, and more recently, the COVID-19 vaccine. According to Nobel Prize-winning economist and one-time New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, some of the worst people in America are about to take power. Krugman asserted that much of the political and business world is prostrating itself at the feet of the least qualified man, morally and intellectually, ever to occupy the White House. But what's truly extraordinary, Krugman wrote in his podcast, is the way billionaires have been abasing themselves before Donald Trump. Lawyers for Trump and two high-profile nominees, that is Pete Hegseth and Kash Patel, are blanketing American journalists with threats of defamation lawsuits for what they have said or written. According to American historian and podcaster Heather Cox Richardson, there are signs Trump media intimidation that Trump's media intimidation campaign is working with the acquiescence of the Disney-owned ABC network in a generous defamation settlement with Trump, sudden withdrawal of an election day editorial by Washington Post and Amazon owner Jeff Bezos, and cancellation of fact-checking services by Meta head Mark Zuckerberg. But Greg Clark, who's no relation to the author of this article, and who's a nuclear scientist and a former head of L'Oreal Satellite Company and Rupert Murdoch's one-time technology supremo, is optimistic about the Trump presidency. He told Planet Politics he expects significant economic growth to result from a Trump era of lower taxes, less regulation, and more efficiencies in government. Meanwhile, Trump has spent much of the 76 days between his election victory and inauguration sowing doubt about the future of the US as a military underwriter of the West. On the eve of his second four-year term, the bulwark of the West defence still remains the NATO alliance. This effectively operates under the US nuclear umbrella. NATO 2025 has 32 members. It has absorbed states peeling away from a collapsing Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc and Yugoslav Federation, plus once neutral Finland and Sweden seeking NATO's protection following Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The NATO alliance has a list of aspiring members, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, where World War I was triggered by the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand, plus Georgia, Macedonia, and most controversially, Ukraine. The latter joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program in 1994 and applied to join its membership action plan in 2008. This is still pending. After Russia's 2014 occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and the incursion of Russian-backed irregulars into parts of eastern Ukraine, Ukraine's government renewed efforts to join NATO, which have not been so far successful. 8 years later, Russian leader Vladimir Putin ordered a full invasion of Ukraine. How Europe's worst conflict since World War II will end is just about impossible to forecast. But the post-US presidential election outlook for an independent Ukraine retaining its existing borders is dim at best. Incoming President Donald Trump has lambasted NATO members as scarcely better than freeloaders and has said he would quickly bring the Ukraine conflict to an end. For many, the implication is that he would force concessions on Kiev, like the permanent handover of Crimea to Russia. Doubts about the US commitment to NATO reflect a broader concern about Trump America's role in the US-ordained post-war order. However, a recent New York Times poll suggests broad public support in America for Trump's get tough and deport approach to illegal immigrants and determination to pull back from America's foreign commitments. Meanwhile, Trump's disruptive rhetoric dominates the headlines, but is arguably a symptom more than a cause of a fracturing world. The collapse of the communist Eastern Bloc in 1989, disintegration of the Soviet Union 2 years later, and the dramatic rise of China have meant that over the past 45 years, the collective glue provided by the Cold War and global dominance of the US no longer adheres over the American populace. Explanations for America's domestic fracturing veer towards culture wars, hostility to wokedom, and the state of the economy. Under Biden, the latter is performing much better, or has been performing much better, than his partisan critics suggest. Moreover, the atomizing after the Cold War's absence has had on the American psyche has been largely absent from explanations by many of the great and the good. Meanwhile, Elon Musk is running amok. The world's richest man, with interests ranging from Tesla to SpaceX, has been parodied as president and co-president after he parlayed between 150 and 250 million American dollars in Trump election campaign contributions into a pole position at Trump's president-waiting table at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Musk's elevation, along with that of Meta head Mark Zuckerberg and Amazon boss Jeff Bezos, symbolize high-tech's answer to the Manchu court as Trump prepares to enter the White House once again. Trump's tech trinity is tasked with ensuring America remains dominant through technological innovation. On the other hand, outgoing US President Joe Biden warns about a wealthy oligarchy threatening US democracy. A crumbling free press and the threat to everyday Americans' rights posed by a tech-industrial complex. Donald Trump's cabinet choices, his musings about sharply increasing tariffs and forcibly acquiring Greenland and Panama and the Panama Canal and making Canada the 51st US state, plus fissures in the MAGA movement, have led to a widely divergent range of forecasts about America's future trajectory, from an almighty boom to a terrible reckoning. One possibility is that there in fact will be both. That is, a boom followed by a reckoning. Whatever happens, it's coming.